Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jamal Robinson. I'm a implementation consultant here at Continia Software, and you are here at the Continia Document Capture Partner Training Program. So I want to thank you for taking the time to join us and learn about Continia Document Capture. This is a 4-week program where we'll talk about all things involved with Continia Document Capture and the implementation process as a Business Central consultant. We'll primarily be focused on Business Central cloud implementations and the US localization. So as a consultant, you may want to ask yourself, why do you want your clients to choose document capture and use Continia for their accounts payable process? Some key highlights of using document capture is using the OCR scanning and processing of those PDF incoming invoices. And because we're fully embedded inside of Microsoft Business Central, all of those invoices will be fully indexed and archived inside of the environment. And because they're being scanned in by the OCR, they're fully searchable within the database. It allows you to control the costs as your client's AP department could implement different levels of approval. We also have the ability to match to purchase orders. And if your client chooses to, we also have options to implement what is known as the Continia Web Approval Portal, which is a separate website to handle the approval process if your client has approval users that they do not want within Business Central. And because we are fully built inside of Business Central, the user interface should be easy for your client's finance team to learn and use. If they're learning Business Central for the first time, it's also very easy to learn Continia at the same time to just start the process and learn about accounts payable automation as they are purchasing Business Central as a new ERP system. So what is the typical document flow when using Continia Document Capture? We have some incoming documents, either in paper form or in an email as a PDF attachment. You can then import those documents. If they're paper documents, they could be scanned in from an external scanner, or if they're in an email format, it can be forwarded into Business Central and Continia through what is known as a cloud OCR email. So your client could create an automatic forwarding rule from their vendor-facing email into Continia's OCR email. This can also be auto-forwarded from their scanner as well. It gets processed by Continia services via the cloud OCR. And inside of document capture, we are training these documents based on a template-based system per vendor, where each vendor has a corresponding vendor template. We train the template on capturing information from those incoming documents to create the repeatable capture of the necessary information. Once the template is built, we can then register the document to create the Business Central transaction. You can send it through an approval process if needed. It can be posted in Business Central and then archived inside of Business Central. So we're here at the Continia Document Capture Partner Training Program, and here is the agenda for the program. It is broken down in 8 sessions, which is designed to take you through the implement process from start to finish. We're here today at session 1, when we'll talk about the introduction and foundation for you as a partner, as a consultant, what you need to do to start off an implementation on the right path. We'll then go into processing documents. We'll learn about the basics of document capture. We'll have a session where we'll capture header information. We'll have a session where we'll capture line information. We'll have a session where we'll talk about purchase order matching. We'll have a session where we talk about the approval process. And then finally, as a partner, we'll talk about how you would prepare for go live and what are some of the go live activities that you'll need to conduct before you take your client live in their production environment. So what to expect from this training program? I want to give you a high level overview of what this program is really about. This program is an essential skills program detailing the entire implementation lifecycle. So here at Continia, I support partners and clients in implementations. I train partners, I train clients on using our solutions. So I'm going to give you what, from my experience here at Continia North America, what a normal implementation looks like, what a partner goes through, some of the struggles that a partner may find themselves in when implementing document capture, and we'll also talk about the best practices. So this program is primarily intended for new consultants and those learning Continia for the first time. Maybe you've done one or two projects with Continia document capture. Maybe you've never had a Continia document capture implementation before. This program is designed for you to learn what we do, Continia North America's recommendations on a normal, typical implementation, and it is your guide to our best practices. Now, we know that every client is different. Some clients may be simple, some clients may be more complex in their business, the way that they process, and their particular needs and requirements for their use case of continued document capture. So my goal is, you'll learn the foundation of how to implement and the functionality and setups of continued document capture. So I'm hoping that you can take this course as a base layer, and then you'll be able to replicate the core values and the core processes, and then be able to apply those best practices to the more complex scenarios that you may face in your individual client interactions. So this program, you should be able to have a great foundation to move forward in your Business Central practice. So we've allotted 2 hours per session. Not all sessions will be 2 hours. There's a lot of material to cover, and I'll try to keep a normal pace for everyone to be able to grasp concepts fully and be able to completely understand the content that I will cover. So we shouldn't go over 2 hours, but there may be some sessions that may go under 2 hours so that we can leave some more time in your day to handle your normal business. These sessions will be recorded and shared to this group afterwards. I'll be sending an email recap of each call. So it's highly recommended that you download and save these recordings after I send them, after every session, so that you can have them for future reference. You will not be able to speak during this training program, so you will remain on mute, just so that we can stay on track with the time allowed for these calls and to make sure that I'm able to cover all of the necessary material. But any questions that you may have during the session, we have the Q&A tab in the Zoom meeting. So please utilize the Q&A tab. If there's something that you might want me to cover again, if there may be a concept that you need further clarification on, or use the Q&A tab to give us any relevant feedback, right? So this is a new endeavor for Continia. We want to improve. We want to be able to service you as the partner better in the field. So if there's an aspect of the program that you would like changed, or if you have any feedback, positive or negative, please let us know so that we can improve and provide better service to you as a partner. And I will be checking knowledge throughout the program using the polls feature of Zoom. So I will be stopping in the middle and making sure that we can confirm our understanding of the topics that I'm covering and the content. So please participate in the polls and also utilize the Q&A tab if there's something that I missed, or if you need me to reiterate or cover a concept a little bit more in depth if you need it. So we're here today at session 1, where we'll talk about the introduction and foundation of being a partner and implementing Continia document capture. So my goals for today's session is for you to understand what the pre-kickoff requirements are. As a partner, when you first get a project for Continia document capture, there is some pre-work that is going to be needed to make sure that you're starting off the implementation on the right foot. So there's certain considerations for you and certain considerations for your client before you introduce them to their environment, before you start testing Continia document capture. There's some questions that we need answered. And we're hoping that you as the partner are asking the right questions and gathering the right information from your clients. We'll cover how to install and activate our application inside of Business Central Cloud environments. And then we'll also explore the fundamentals and the initial setups of Continia document capture. How do we initially set the stage to do some of the basic setups so that the environment is set up to introduce the client into the environment? So as a partner, your sales team has sold Continia, and you as the consultant has gotten this project to implement. So the first thing that you want to do is ask your organization or confirm, do you have a Continia Partner Zone account? So Continia's Partner Zone is a internal resource for partners. It's a website that is a resource for you as the partner to manage your clients and to gain resources and relevant materials in order to implement our solutions. Your Partner Zone credentials are required to activate our products. So if you do not have one already, you want to make sure that you're able to log into Continia's Partner Zone, and then you have login credentials so that you're able to activate our solutions. You also want to confirm, do you have a Continia project work plan? So the Continia project work plan is an internal document. It was created by Continia North America from our services team, and we use this internally to manage projects. This is a document that you could also gain access to, and you can use the work plan to manage projects. So this is coming directly from Continia. This is what Continia uses when we implement. So this is a vital resource for you as a partner to also manage your implementations with. I'll be covering the work plan in detail on this call, but this work plan has everything you need from start to finish so that you can properly implement our solutions. And I'll dive deeper into what the work plan is and its intention. So you want to make sure that for this project, you as the partner, you're able to gain access to the sandbox and production environments. We always suggest that when you get a new Continia project, that you're creating a current copy of your client's production environment, because we want to make sure that the master records are consistent between both environments. I'll touch a little bit about the reasons why as we move forward in the program, but the main reason is because Continia document capture uses a template-based system to capture information and to build Business Central transactions and data. We're doing mapping to data in BC. So we need the vendor table to be consistent. We need the chart of accounts, the items, the dimensions to be consistent between both environments, because vendor templates are going to have posting setups, and it's going to have dimension setups, and it's going to refer to potentially items and accounts in the system. So if we do a template mapping to a vendor in the sandbox that does not exist in the live production environment, that template essentially becomes invalid. And all of the work that you've done in sandbox, you cannot migrate into production. All of the work that your client does in their sandbox environment, we can migrate all of that work to the live production environment. So that's why we want to make sure that the master records are current and consistent, because that helps out your client and makes the implementation more successful when we go live, because all of the templates that we've created in Sandbox can be migrated to production, and your client is better off with already having all of those vendor templates set up. And here's some of the items that we want you to consider when you're completing client discovery during this period prior to the client kickoff. Some of the questions that you want to ask your client, and you want to gather information about: who are our leads, our admins, and our test users? Who are our approval users? And what is the expected approval flow? So this allows us to identify who will we be training and who will we be setting up to test document capture in the client sandbox. We want to make sure that we're gathering example documents. This is vitally important for document capture, as I'll discuss later on. You want to identify the dimensions that they want to use. We want to identify the different types of emails that they want to set up. So for document capture, there should be an inbound email and an outbound email. The inbound email is what they give partners and vendors to submit those PDF files into the system. The outbound email is used for notifications, possibly approval notification emails. So we would also hope that there's an outbound email set up in the Business Central environment. And then finally, you want to confirm what is the expected go live date. Okay. So now I'm going to switch screens here, and now I'm going to share what is known as the Continia project work plan. So you should see an Excel document here. This is the Continia project work plan. As I've mentioned, this is an internal document created by Continia that you as the partner could get access to. So I'll be sending this document to everyone who is on this call in my follow-up recap email. But this document can also be requested by your organization from our services manager or your partner account manager at Continia. So if you have a consultant in your organization who needs this document, just reach out to someone at Continia North America, and we'll be happy to send you this document. This document has several tabs, and each tab does something different. So we're here at the first tab for estimating. So the estimating tab allows you as the partner to define the scope of the project that is currently on your plate to implement. We're asking you a couple of questions with the goal to understand your client, understand their business, understand the environment, which will help us determine the scope of the Continia implementation and the meetings and the tasks involved to properly implement. So it's filtered right now on the product for document capture, but you can choose other products in Continia. We'll choose the environment. We're focusing on cloud, so Business Central Cloud. And when we choose those options, we get a set of questions. We want to know, what is the expected volume for your client? How many documents do they normally process per month? How many companies will we be implementing? So for this client, are they only implementing document capture in one company, or will you be implementing document capture in multiple companies? We would like to know the number of companies that you plan to implement document capture. And then we want to also know that, do these companies share those master records? In each company, do they share the same vendor list? Do they share the same chart of accounts? Do they share the same dimensions, and so on and so forth? We ask this question because this is very important with the scope, because let's say that each of these companies do not share master records. let's say that they want to implement 2 companies, and each company, the vendor list is different, the chart of accounts is different, dimensions are different. That would essentially mean that we're conducting 2 individual implementations. Because think about it. If inside of Container Document Capture, we are a template-based system and each vendor has a corresponding vendor template, and the vendor template includes mappings to posting accounts and to dimension values that do not exist in one company then in the other company, that means you'll have to create multiple 2 basically sets of templates. One set of vendor templates for the one company for the one mapping to that data, and then a completely other set of templates for the second company because the mapping involved is to a different set of data. So the number of companies really drive the amount of hours that could be involved in an implementation, because if the master records differ, then we'd have to duplicate our efforts in one company to the other companies. But if they share the same master data records, then we can probably just focus on the one company and be able to migrate all of the templates from the one company to the second company because the data is the same, the data is consistent, we'll be processing everybody the same between the 2 companies. So that's a very important question that you want to ask yourself and the client. And a lot of partners do sometimes get into trouble when defining the scope and when they're quoting hours because they think that, our efforts can be duplicated. But if they're implementing multiple companies, you have to do different sets of training and different sets of capture, building those vendor templates. So it will increase the hours of the project based on the number of companies that you're implementing. Next, we want to define our test users. Who are the users that we're going to set up? How many Business Central administrators are there? When we talk about document processors, this is usually the AP staff who is responsible for creating those individual vendor templates. So the document processors are the individuals creating the vendor templates. These are the individuals who know the business, they know AP, they know how vendors are set up as far as the posting setups, as far as a dimension breakdown, if it exists. So these are the individuals knowledgeable about the AP process. Those are going to be our main users of document capture because they're going to be the ones responsible for creating those templates. How many approval users will we be setting up? And what you need to be aware of with the approval users is, in order to be an approval user in Continia, you need at least a Teams member license in Business Central. So this is another aspect that partners and clients are unaware of. To be an approver, you need at least a Teams member license. So some partners aren't aware that a license is required to be an approver. Does your client want to capture lines when they create those vendor templates? This is a yes or no question. Does your client deal with purchase order matching? So these 2 questions help us decide how many hours of training that might be involved. If your client does not capture lines, or if your client does not match to purchase orders in their business at all, that might be an aspect of training that you don't need to cover because they'll never utilize it. So that's why these questions are important. Advanced line capture goes hand in hand with line capture. Most times, if a client does want to capture line detail, you might need to involve some of our advanced line capture techniques, because in the US, I've found out that a lot of vendors send in many different types of vendor invoices. They come in different formats and invoice layouts. So sometimes line capture isn't as simple with most vendors in the US. So we do have to use some of our advanced techniques to capture line data. And I'll go through some of those line capturing techniques when we had this session about capturing lines in document capture. So this question about additional document categories, so I'll cover this today, but when you purchase Continia Document Capture, you not only get access to create purchase invoices, there's also other document categories that you can take advantage of to create other types of transactions inside of Business Central. You're able to, create sales orders, you're able to create purchase orders, and there's other document categories that I'll cover today as well. This is just a question that, would affect training as well. If your client wants to take advantage of the additional document categories, that might involve an additional training session on how to process those different document categories. So these questions help define how many training meetings we may need to conduct during this implementation. Next, we want to think about the approval requirements of your client. Does your client only need to use the standard approval method by dollar amount? This will follow the standard purchase invoice approval chain based on dollar amount. Would they have a need for maybe a more configurable type of approval process? We have a feature called approval flows in document capture that can be implemented depending on your client's needs. And maybe you might find out that your client needs our advanced approval option. Advanced approvals is looking at the line detail, and it's driving approvals based on line level dimensions. So a part of defining the project scope, a part of your client discovery, you want to ask your client, how would they like approvals to work inside of Business Central? And then if you can, have them provide a rough draft of maybe an approval matrix or on, who's responsible and maybe what they would like approvals to look like. Does your client have a need to implement the Continia Web Approval Portal? This is a yes or no question. So the Web Approval Portal is a separate website that your client can take advantage of to conduct the approval process. So this is for your client if they have approval users that they do not want within Business Central. They still want to approve documents, but they don't want them in BC, so that we can implement the Web Approval Portal, which is an outside website that they can handle approvals with. Just know that the approval portal requires an app registration in your client's Azure Active Directory. So usually this is an activity for your client's IT department to create the app registration in Azure, and then we'll take those credentials from Azure and then we'll enter them inside of Business Central. And we'll cover the setup of the Web Approval Portal in a future session. Here's a place where you as the partner could add some value here. So you want to ask your client, who's responsible for setting up templates, and how many templates does your client feel that they need before they're comfortable going live with? So you as the partner could provide some service to your client to say, hey, maybe I'll take control and be responsible for setting up your vendor templates. This is a good opportunity to earn some billable hours. Maybe the client says, we don't want to be concerned with creating templates ourselves. You as the partner, you set up every vendor template for us. This is a good way for you to service your client that way. And then we want to talk about go live. How many templates does your client really need to go live with? And this is a question, and this is how I want you to start the conversation with your clients when you get a new Continia implementation. You want to get them thinking about their current business and their vendor list. Who are those repeatable, consistent vendors that your client processes on a consistent basis? Have them think about who they work with most frequently, who do they pay most frequently? Because those are the vendors that we want to focus on. And those are the vendor templates that we want to make sure that we completely set up prior to go live. If you can get your client to identify, maybe 10 to 20 vendors that they know that they process on the most each month, identify those vendors and let's focus on those vendors in Sandbox to make sure that we set up those vendor templates first. Because if we can handle the majority of their vendors right away, that's a great way for you as the partner to gain confidence with your client, to create those wins for your client, to really get them acclimate, acclimated and thinking positively about using document capture. So I really want you to do a deep dive and really having your client identify and sort of think about their vendors, how they use them today, who are their frequent flyers, who do they use the most, because those are the ones that we want to focus on. Does your client inside of their business central environment have any customizations that Continia needs to be aware of? Usually this is anything affecting the AP side. So if there's a customization that may affect the order of entry, the validation, or the posting logic of any field that gets used during the AP process, we want to know about it because we might need to make sure that we're accounting for it, and maybe there's some development that needs to happen to make sure that Continia and your client's customizations communicate correctly between each other inside of BC. So you want to, ask your client or you as the partner, if you know how their environment is set up, you want to make us aware if there's any customizations or verticals that may affect the AP process in any way. And as far as localizations is concerned, we're going to focus on the US localization. So I know that we might have some Canadian partners on the call. There is no specific Canadian app for document capture. You would just use our base app, our worldwide app for Canadian clients. But for our US partners on the call, we want to make sure that we're downloading and we're activating the US localization for your client. There's some special considerations for the US version of Continia Document Capture that we want to make sure that your client is installing and activating in their environment. So that's the estimating tab. We use the estimating tab to ask relevant questions that help us define the scope of the project. So let's drop a yes or no into the chat if that makes sense, what the purpose of the estimating tab, and for you as the partner, how you can use this estimating tab to sort of start the process to help you define the scope, which would help you define the hours that you're going to quote. Because the questions that you answer in the estimating tab trickles into the services tab. So based on the questions that you answer, it provides an output of Continia's recommendation. So this is just Continia's recommendation on the minimum service hours for implementation based on the answers to the questions that you've provided in the estimating tab. So this is just the base, what Continia thinks the project would take. It is up to you as the partner to take this estimate and then based on your organization's needs, capacity, requirements, to add your own hours and to quote your own hours to your client. So you can utilize this work plan, answer the questions to get like a base layer of what the hours might be. And then based on your organization's needs, add on top of any other hours that you may feel is involved. And then you can use that to quote your client. So it's not up to Continia to create that quote. It's up to you as the partner to create that final quote for your client. But the services tab can give you an idea of what Continia North America sees that a project of that size could potentially take based on the estimating tab. So feel free to use the output of the estimating and take the services and add your own hours if needed. So that's the services tab, which is help define the hours involved for the project. And then the estimating tab also helps you when it comes to the project plan tab. So the project plan tab is a list of milestones of meetings and tasks that are involved in a typical basic continued document capture implementation. So we've kind of laid out the groundwork for you as the partner to keep track. So I'm assuming that you've already had a demo. This is the part of the client discovery aspect of the project. You're talking about the client's requirements. They've seen a demo of document capture. You've talked about their current AP process. And then we're here at the technical kickoff. So the technical kickoff is where you want to involve the key decision makers and the IT department. So we're going to define the technical requirements for your client, for them, and for you as the partner to set the stage before you introduce the client to the environment to a client kickoff call. So you want to have a technical kickoff internally with the IT resources, and you want to assign the pre-kickoff requirements for yourself as the partner and for the client to complete prior to doing any sort of initial install and activation and prior to introducing the client to the environment to have that kickoff call. The kickoff call should be designed to bring in the client to a set up environment, allow them to do some initial training and to get them used to submitting documents and to start the process of creating those vendor templates for continued document capture. So there are some activities involved before you have any client-facing kickoff calls with the client. And I'll talk about what those pre-kickoff requirements are. But as you can see, the project plan is very detailed and you can keep track. You can add dates and then you can, keep track of the status, right? You've had a technical kickoff with the IT resources. You've assigned the pre-kickoff requirements. They've been completed. You've done the initial install. You've done the initial configurations. And then you introduce the client. There can be a meeting when you talk about the approval process. You can bring in Continia to discuss the options within Continia to handle the approval process. So that could be a meeting. You want to set up the web approval portal. You want to configure users and permissions before we do any sort of training. Then we get into the training meetings. So with these meetings, Continia recommends that you follow sort of like a process when you're doing your training with the client, that you show them the concept, you teach them about an aspect of using continued document capture, but then the client has to go off and start testing on their own. So using and implementing document capture involves the client testing and creating documents on their own, using a lot of learning and being proficient in document capture involves hands-on training, hands-on learning, creating and building that confidence by utilizing your own environment, your own examples. So the way that Continia likes to conduct our training is we'll have a meeting where we'll discuss the concepts and teach about the concept. The client goes off on their own and starts to test and replicate the examples that we've shown them with their own documents. And then we'll come back for a Q&A session. Based on the client's own testing and understanding, the client should then come back with questions, and then we'll have a meeting where we're troubleshooting and we're supporting the client around the concept that the client has been trained on and the client has tested with on their own. So we like to separate our training sessions based on the topic. There should be a session about header capture. There should be a session about line capture. There should be a session about purchase order matching. And then finally, there should be just a session about all of those aspects. So we do follow a set structure where we try to separate and build on the confidence as your client is learning document capture. We don't try to bombard the client with everything at once because it's a lot of content to absorb. So we focus on the most basic level first, which is header capture. Then we'll move on to something a little bit more complex, which is line capture. And then we'll move on to the most complex, which is purchase order matching. Because purchase order matching could involve header capture and it can also include line capture at the same time. So we want to build confidence in your client by starting off with the basic concepts first and then moving on to more advanced concepts as they learn and as they start to test on their own. So what I see that partners sometimes get into trouble with, they don't allow for this testing period. They try to cram in all of the training back to back to back and don't allow their client to go off on their own to create documents on their own and for the client to come back with questions of their own. So the client really needs to use the system on their own, really get a sense of creating those documents on their own and creating their own questions based on their own level of understanding of the solution. So we really hope, and that's what I'll show you in this program, right? The way that this program is designed is we'll have a session covering a particular topic, and then I would hope that you watch the recording and you try to practice on your own. And then if you did have questions, that you let us know if you did have questions. But we try to start off with the easy level first and then move on to more complex concepts later on. Let's drop a yes or no into the chat if that makes sense as far as how Continue North America likes to approach training, how document capture is really dependent on the client testing, creating documents on their own, using document capture on their own, and then coming up with their own questions and not just leaning on you, the partner, to sort of support them because eventually we want those clients to be self-sufficient, right? We want clients to be able to use document capture on their own and not have to bring you in for every single question. We want the client to to be able to use the system. We have a meeting where we'll talk about user setup and administration. We'll have a training session about being an approval user. And then you as the partner, you need to let Continue know if you're going to need support for go live. So we're very busy. We're all busy, right? So we need to be informed beforehand if you're going to need support from us because we'll need to plan for it. So depending on the go live date, which you should already know, schedule those calls with us prior to go live and post go live if you need that support. Hopefully you're a part of this training program, so you'll have the tools at your disposal that you might not need to bring us in for this level of support. But if you do need to bring us in, you have to plan for it accordingly. I see a lot of partners get to the 23rd hour their back is against the wall. They have a go live tomorrow that they're not prepared for, but they expect Continia to drop everything. We need to know beforehand so we can plan for it. So please let us know if you need support for a go live so we can schedule the appropriate time to assist you. So that's the project plan. Pretty self-explanatory. You can use this. You can replicate this. So if this project plan is too detailed, you can take these tasks, take these meetings, and create your own plan based on your own client's needs, based on your capacity as a partner. So use this project plan as a base to create your own if you need it. But again, this document could be provided to you. You can replicate this for not only your first project, but you can keep the blank template and then copy it for every single Continia project that you may have. So that's the project plan. Next, we have the kickoff tab, the pre-kickoff tab. So we talked about those pre-kickoff requirements and the client and partner considerations before you introduce the client to the environment. These are questions and conversations that you should have with your client. So as far as the client is concerned, again, we want to identify our key resources. Who are the individuals that we will be setting up to test? Who is our IT resources at the client that we need to bring in for some of our IT setups? So we want to make sure that we know who we're dealing with and their contact information. Gathering the example documents is step one, and probably the most important aspect of document capture that really dictates the level of success in an implementation. Not only do we need different types of examples, so for the vendors that are just simple cost invoices, maybe just one amount for one posting account, we want those examples for that particular type of document. We also want invoices where they might want to capture line detail. So maybe this is multiple accounts for multiple amounts at the line level. We would need example documents for that. For those cases where your client wants to match to purchase orders, we need those invoice examples that they want to match to a purchase order. And we also need for the purchase orders to be in the sandbox. So not only do we need the document, but we need for the purchase order to be in the system so that we can train and teach on how to properly match to existing purchase orders. So you need the document and you need the purchase order to exist in Business Central. And then if they're utilizing any other document categories, what are those documents that we want to bring in? So we need the different types of documents for the different types of vendors that they process, and we need multiple for each type. So the first example is going to be used to train the template to confirm that we're picking up the right information. But all future examples are going to test, did the template pick up the right information, and is the template working properly? So while you're having that vendor conversation, when we're identifying the frequently used vendors, we want multiple examples from the same vendor. So for those vendors who are simple, just header amounts, we want a couple of those vendors. For those vendors who are just capturing lines, we want multiple examples for the same vendor. And then so on and so forth for the matching vendors. So we're going to focus on header first, building on that knowledge. Then we'll focus on the vendors for lines, focus on setting up templates for lines, and then we'll focus on setting up templates for the vendors where you'll match the purchase orders. We want to identify the dimensions and the users that we're going to set up. So when we're talking about dimensions, are there ways to auto-populate dimensions inside of BC? So we know that dimensions can come in different ways. It could be auto-populated from the vendor card. It could be auto-populated from the underlying GL account. If the client is matching to purchase orders, dimensions could also auto-populate from the purchase order. So you want to have a conversation with your client to say, like, how are dimensions being defined for your environment? Do they have to be manually defined by the user? Do we need to expose the dimension to the template and capture the dimension in the template? Or could it be defaulted in from base BC? So allow BC to fill in those gaps, allow BC to default in dimensions if it works out that way for your client. We don't always have to expose the dimension to the template if it could be auto-populated. So we talked about the users, we talked about the approval users and the approval flow that they may want to implement. Start the conversation. Ask your client, who are the approval users that we want to set up? And do you have a process today with how you would like approvals to function? You'll get that input from the client, and then you can have a conversation with Continia, based on what the client has told you. What are the options within Continia that can help you create the approval process that your client is looking for? Remember, approval users need at least a Teams member license in Business Central. These are the considerations for the client's IT department. They need to create those emails. They need to create a vendor-facing inbound email for those PDF attachments to bring into BC. This can be AP@clientsdomain.com, invoices@clientsdomain.com, whatever email address that they want to create to give to their vendors. The client's IT department needs to create a forwarding rule from that inbound email into the Continia email so that invoices could auto-process and auto-import inside of Continia and Business Central. They would also need to create an outbound email. Like I said earlier, the outbound email is used for outbound email notifications. Most times in document capture, this is for approval notification emails. So if your client wants to send out an email to their approval users when they have something new to approve, there needs to be an outbound email set up in BC. And what is the go live date, right? So the go live date allows us to plan accordingly to schedule out the necessary meetings. So for you as the partner, you'll, quote and accept those hours based on our estimate, but you'll create your own estimate using that as a base. You want to make sure that you have a partner zone account because your credentials are used for activation. We talked about having a current copy of production in a sandbox environment. Your partner account needs to have super permissions and no company restrictions. So you need to have super permissions and the super permissions across all companies. You need to know that some partner zone accounts, so these delegated admin partner accounts, you cannot run a job queue, you cannot send an outbound email, and you cannot log into the web approval portal for your client. So that's why it's important that we have those test users so that they can test these functionalities. So there is some limitation to those delegated admin partner accounts. We'll do the install and activation of the sandbox. We'll confirm that the sandbox data is okay. We'll install the localized app, and we want to make sure that allow HTTP client request is turned on for the Continia core and for the document capture app in sandbox. This allows the sandbox to communicate with Continia online. So when you install and activate, we want to make sure that we enable allow HTTP client requests on our apps inside of BC. A way to manage users is through Azure security groups. So this is for the client's IT department. Here are the out-of-the-box permission sets. So based on the role of a particular user, they need to make sure that they're assigned the appropriate permission set. And the permission sets could be added to security groups. And then all your client needs to do is make sure that users are assigned the appropriate security group. We've talked about the emails already. You want to confirm that the inbound email is created, confirm that the outbound email is created. Something to know about the inbound email The inbound email should only be implemented for production. We will generate a new Continia online email between Sandbox and production. So those emails will be different. So the client's IT department just needs to make sure that the inbound email is set up in production. The outbound email could be set up in Sandbox because we want to test out the approvals, notification emails in Sandbox. You want to confirm that the client's IT department configured the web approval portal. Remember, this involves creating an app registration in the client's Azure Active Directory, and there's instructions that you can provide the client. And then finally, how are we going to store those documents? Are we going to store those invoices inside of the Business Central database? Or depending on the volume, do we want to use Azure Blob Storage? So depending on the volume, it might be in your client's best interest to implement Azure Blob Storage. You as the partner could help them create the right type of storage account. Here is just Continia's recommendations. It's up to you and the client to actually set it up. This is just what Continia feels is the basic setups for Azure Blob. You don't have to take these recommendations. You can create your own. This is just what we feel is needed. So that's the pre-kickoff requirements. So the pre-kickoff requirements are the activities that should be conducted before you introduce the client to the environment. We have the kickoff tab, which allows you to, take some notes about the client. And we have some good documentation links. And we have some common pages, common features, and common functions. So the kickoff tab is a great resource that allows you to keep track of the project. And in a future session, I'll go through the Go Live tab. So the Go Live tab is going to be your resource that you'll use to go live. These are the tasks associated with taking a project from Sandbox to production. So we laid out step by step the activities to prepare the Sandbox and then for you to install, activate, and migrate into production. So that's why this document is so important and is such a great resource for you. So I highly suggest that when I send you this document that you save it, you keep it, and you take advantage of it for all of your future projects. Okay. So I'm going to launch a poll. So please go to your poll. The question is, what is the purpose of the Continia project work plan? Okay. So the question is, what is the purpose of the Continia project work plan? The answers were define scope, understand technical requirements, prepare for client kickoff, or all of the above. The answer was all of the above. So the Continia project work plan is your resource to define the project scope, understand the technical requirements to give out to the client and yourself, and to prepare the client for the client kickoff into the Sandbox environment. Okay. So now I'm going to go into BC. So we should see Business Central, and I'm going to take you through how we would install and activate Document Capture. So for you as the partner, you'll go to Extension Management in BC. You'll see your list of apps in the environment. Right now, we currently have installed the Continia Document Capture US app. So this is the localized application for Continia Document Capture. So for you as the partner, when you're in the Sandbox, you would go to App Source Gallery and you would search for Continia Document Capture US. And you'll install and activate the app from the App Source Gallery. Pretty straightforward. And then you want to make sure that after you install, you'll go to the app, you'll go to Continia Core, and you'll make sure that allow HTTP client request is turned on. So you'll do that with Continia Core, and then you'll do that to the Document Capture US app as well. You'll turn on allow HTTP client requests for the localized app. So you'll go to App Source Gallery, install the localized app, and allow HTTP client requests. After you do that, there's different places that you could go to activate. You can go to the page, Continia Solution Management. So Continia Solution Management, you'll see what you've installed. And then from here, you can go to Manage Subscription in the ribbon, and that will take you to the activation wizard. You'll follow the activation wizard, and you want to make sure that you're confirming the modules that your client wants to purchase. And Sandbox is free, so you could activate all modules in Sandbox. But you might want to make note of which modules they actually want to go live with, because each module has an associated cost. So the essential module is the base module to use document capture. This always needs to be activated. Advanced capture is the module if your client wants to capture any lines. So if there's any line recognition involved, line capture, you'll need the advanced capture module activated. Order matching is for purchase order matching. So if your client is doing any purchase order matching, you need the order matching modules activated. Document approval is for the approval process. So if your client wants to use Continia's approval workflows and the approval options within Continia, they'll need the document approval module activated. And then we have another module for purchase contracts. So purchase contracts is a module for recurring cost invoices. This is usually for like subscription-based invoices costs. So for like rent or utilities, and it's usually for a way to manage those subscriptions and kind of build in an auto approval workflow for those subscriptions. So this is an optional module. Sometimes it's used in North America, not always used in North America, but it is a great tool to take advantage of if your client has a need for it, if they want to be able to have a place to sort of monitor those recurring subscriptions and to create some sort of automatic approval process for those recurring expenses. And I'll talk about purchase contracts in a future session. So you can go to Continuous Solution Management. You can go to Manage Subscription and activate that way. Confirm your modules, accept terms and conditions, and then enter in some client information and then activate. And remember, you'll need your partner zone credentials in order to activate. So that's how you would activate via Continuous Solution Management. You'll go to the app and go to Manage Subscription. Another way to activate, you can search for the page, Set Up Document Capture. So the page Set Up Document Capture, when this is run after you install and activate Document Capture, this is also going to run. This is the setup wizard that loads the initial configurations and setup of document capture. So you can also go to a set up document capture. It would also prompt you to enter in your partner's own credentials to activate the solution. And then the action. So when you first run this, the action that you're going to select is import configuration, and you're going to import from online. So importing the initial configuration from Continia Online would load the system default settings, which will help you do and set up the environment to get you started right away. So importing the initial configuration from online creates some default setups, some default settings. It loads some default data that allows you to immediately start the process and get your client in and start testing. But it's going to be up to you as the partner after you do the initial configuration import from online. You need to take control of those default setups and customize the setups to meet your client's individual needs and requirements. But it's always suggested that when you're doing the initial install and activation in your client sandbox that you always import configuration from online. This is going to set the stage. We've already done this in this environment, but let's say you click next. It's going to download the configuration. It's importing a bunch of setups. And as you can see, if we open this up, here is all of the data that is being initially loaded, right? So we're importing the setup, the document capture setup, and then we're importing all of our system default document categories. So that is why it's very important for you to do the initial setup with document capture so that we're loading the base default system settings to get you started. So after you run set up document capture, and after you have did an initial activation with import configuration from online, we want to go to the page document capture setup. So the page document capture setup is the initial setup page. Here is where we'll define the base settings for document capture. We'll confirm the storage method. Do we want to store documents in the Business Central database, or do we want to store those documents in Azure Blob Storage? If you choose to select Azure Blob Storage, if there's files already existing in the database, we'll ask you, do you want to migrate those setups from the database to Azure? You can click yes or no to run the migration wizard. And when you do implement Azure Blob Storage, you'll get a new set of fields to enter. These are those Azure credentials from your Azure Blob setups. So you'll enter in the storage account, the account key, and the container name of your Azure setups from your Azure Blob storage account. So if your client decides to utilize Azure Blob Storage as the storage method, we'll need these credentials from Azure to set up in BC. I'll just go back to database. Another setting that we change in most North American implementations is how do we want to display the file inside of the system? So by default, we have the Business Central posted document number, but most times I like to change this setting to not only the Business Central posted document number, but the vendor document number. The vendor document number inside of the system is the vendor invoice number. So not only do I want to show the posted document number in BC, I also want to show the vendor invoice number on the file name when you see it in BC. We want to ask the question about how are we validating the amounts when we post. So this is a setting that I sometimes see change to reflect based on how your client creates purchase invoices. And usually this comes into play with how they're managing taxes. So it all depends on if there's tax setups inside of Business Central, because this setting is going to confirm when we post if the amounts that we import, if they match the amounts that Business Central calculates. So when we're training the vendor templates, we're capturing information from the documents. We're capturing a subtotal. We might capture a tax amount, and then we're capturing the amount including tax or the grand total, right? But let's say that your client adds in other fields once the purchase invoice is already created. Maybe they're manipulating the tax amounts. Maybe they're adding in additional lines to the document. Maybe they're changing the invoice in a different way than what we initially import. This is confirming, does the amounts that we import through the template, does it match the amounts that Business Central calculates on the purchase invoice card? So if your client ever changes the amounts, you might run into errors when you try to post because the imported amounts do not match the assigned amounts. Assigned amounts is what Business Central calculates. So you might find that you want to turn off the validation upon posting so that you don't run into those posting errors because your client does make changes to the invoices, and sometimes the amount that you import is not the same than the amount that Business Central calculates. From my experience, this usually comes into play with taxes. Like you might capture a tax amount from the document, but Business Central does a different tax calculation. So your amounts don't equal each other when you create the purchase invoice. Business Central calculates a total amount different than what you import because of the differences between the taxes based on what you capture from the document versus what Business Central may calculate as far as taxes. So you might turn off the validations upon posting so you don't run into those posting errors. So sometimes I see partners run into posting errors. This is where it's coming from. It's that validation on post. We're confirming that the template has the same amount than what Business Central calculates. You have the ability to set an email for somebody at the client who might want to be notified where the system will suggest captions for the master template. So there's a master template that we'll need to configure, and we'll talk about the master template in our next session. But the master template is the basis for all future vendor templates. So it's very important that we configure the master template in a way that it accounts for the majority of information that we want to capture in those vendor documents, right? So because each individual vendor template will have unique captions because each vendor invoice has a different layout, has different information that we'll be capturing, you have the ability to suggest captions based on your existing templates, and those suggestions could be added to the master template so that the master template is a little more effective and a little more intelligent because it's using the history of the vendor templates that you've already created for your existing vendor templates. So you can add an email for somebody at the client who can receive a notification to say, hey, within a period of time, based on your history, the system might want to suggest to you to add some captions to the master template based on the captions you have been teaching your individual vendor templates during your testing. So this is an activity that's usually done prior to go live, where we update the master template with the existing captions that you've used in your existing templates. So you can add an email here for that. From here, we'll talk about how we want to manage the data that we capture. So the data maintenance piece is the OCR data that we're capturing. So when you import and process and scan in those documents, we are capturing OCR data and putting it into a table. So you have the ability to create parameters that say that we must retain some of that OCR data for a number of years before we're required to delete it. So this comes into play for the secure archive as well, because the secure archive could be implemented to retain the documents for a certain period of time before you're allowed to delete the document from the system. So while data maintenance is the OCR data that we're picking up from the document when you scan it and import it, the secure archive is the actual file and the actual document that we're saving. So these are retention periods that you can implement on both of those sides to say it has to be in the system for a period of time before you are allowed to delete the data from the system. So data maintenance is the OCR data. Secure archive is the documents itself that gets saved into the system. So from here, we can go to setup and purchase approval. So in the purchase approval screen from setup purchase approval, we could enable the different workflows. So we'll enable the invoice approval workflow. We've enabled the credit memo approval workflow. And we are also allowing for force approval of documents. So this is a right usually reserved for the Business Central administrator if you want to allow for the force approval of documents. So the Business Central admin can have the ability to force approve documents if they want to take control and not let a document go through the approval process. And if you want to implement workflows for purchase orders and return orders, you could enable those workflows as well. Here is the email that we're using for outbound email notifications. So we're using the default email in the environment. And here under checks and validations, again, do we want to check those amounts on every approval to make sure that the imported matches the assigned amount in BC? And do we want to check the dimensions to make sure that the default dimensions are compliant to the rules set up in BC? Do we want to check them on submission for approval to make sure that the default dimensions are entered? Or do we want to check that the default dimensions are selected during either every approval on the document or only the last approval on the document? So we have some checks and balances for the amounts and dimensions during the approval process. So while amount validation on post is for validating the amounts before posting, setup purchase approval is checking and validating the amounts during the approval process. Sure. And then finally, we have the web approval setups. So once we do the app registration for the web approval portal, we'll enter in the app registration credentials from Azure into this screen, document capture setup, web approval, and we'll add those credentials here. You have the ability to show some dimensions to the approval portal as well. So if there's any shortcut dimensions that the client wants to add for the approval user during the approval process, we can add them to the web approval portal by choosing the dropdown and adding a dimension to show either at the header level or at the line level to the approval user during the approval process. Right? So those are the main aspects and setup fields of document capture setup. Let's drop a yes or no into the chat if that makes sense for document capture setup. Okay. So we're here at the role center. So we've already done the initial setup. We went to document capture setup. Here's just a brief overview of the different role tiles. So we have some role tiles given a particular role center. So we have a submission button. So you can click action, submit documents. These are the different emails for each particular document category. So if we're primarily going to focus on purchase invoices and credit memos for the sandbox environment, this is the email account that your client should submit those example documents into the system. So once you submit an email, it will come into pending OCR. Once it's been OCR scanned, it will then go to ready to import. You can import all files that are ready to import, or you can go to the ready to import role tile and then select individual file to import for a given purchase document category. And then it will come into what is known as ready to register. The ready to register queue is where documents will sit when we create those vendor templates and do our document invoice mapping. We also have a document search feature. So because we are scanning and indexing and archiving these documents, we're making them searchable within BC. So you can use keywords to say, oh, must contain all words or must contain at least one word. And this is just free text for anything that may have been found in the document. You can make searchable. And you can either specify, hey, I only care about the purchase document category. So only documents that you've brought into the purchase document category based on, any sort of data that may have been contained in that document, you can search for it here and you can pull up that document inside of Continia. So that's document search. Very powerful tool. I don't think a lot of clients are aware of it or take advantage of it. This is a manual action to send the approval notification email. And this is also a manual action to send the approval email for purchase contracts. So normally the notification email is submitted automatically through the job queue, but if they want to run it manually, you can run the manual action here. So we're going to focus on our document categories. So here's our available document categories. So the purpose of this training program will start off with the purchase document category, because we'll be focusing on building purchase invoices and purchase credit memos. But like I said, there's other document categories that you can take advantage of to create Business Central transactions. You can take advantage of the purchase order document category to create Business Central purchase orders, or you can take advantage of the sales category to create Business Central sales orders. So these three document categories create Business Central transactions. But we have other document categories that could be used if you want to import, scan, and make searchable a document and attach a document to an existing record inside of BC. So the vendor document category could be used to submit a document and attach it to a vendor record or a vendor card. You can take a document, import it, and attach it to an employee record or an employee card. Customers is for a customer record or a customer card. Contact is for a contact record, contact card. GL documents is for a general ledger entry in the system. Posted purchase receipts is for a posted purchase receipt record inside of Business Central. So while these three categories create Business Central transactions, these other document categories could be used to submit, scan, make searchable, and attach it to an existing record inside of BC. So let's go to the purchase document category because we'll be focusing on purchases for the purpose of our program. Here's the document category card. So this is the underlying settings for the document category card. You can see that here's the email again. So you can copy this email and submit documents to it. There's an email address that you could add to be notified if there's any errors with the OCR. So if there's a BC admin or maybe an IT resource that wants to be notified if there's any errors with processing OCR and maybe invoices get stuck in an error, you can add an email address to the document category so that a user can receive a notification when there's errors, when the OCR can't process a document. But you can see that the source table is just the vendor table, because when we're utilizing the purchase document category, we want to identify a vendor in the system to create that vendor template. We do that through what is known as identification fields. So identification fields, if we open this up, these are fields from the source table. So remember, our source is the vendor table. So these are all fields from the vendor card. We are scanning every page of that incoming invoice, and we're looking for matches from these fields to information from the vendor cards that are set up in your client's environment. So we're looking for a name, address, city, phone number, email, tax ID. And based on the rating, we try to make a match between what we capture from the invoice and we try to make a match to the record in the vendor table based on the rating. So right now, there's a high rating or strength towards the tax registration number. The ratings go from 1 to 5, 5 being the highest strength. But if your client never includes the tax ID number in their vendor cards, and if the vendor never includes a tax ID number on their incoming documents, maybe tax ID number isn't the right field to have such a high rating. Maybe the email account is always there. Maybe your client always adds the email account to the vendor card, and maybe the vendor always includes the email address on their documents. So maybe you want to increase the strength of the email, or maybe they always include their phone number on the documents, and the phone numbers are accurate between the vendor cards. So maybe you want to increase the rating for phone number. So it's up to you and the client to decide which fields are important to us based on the fields that we enter in the vendor cards, based on the information that the client sends us in those incoming invoices. So this is what the system uses by default to try to identify and capture a vendor when a document comes into the system. So this is probably the first thing that I see partners and clients struggle with when they first starting to use Continia. They have questions on like, oh, why did the system find the incorrect vendor? Why is it choosing this vendor? I'll show you in a future session, what the system is doing, but it's looking at these identification fields, is looking at these ratings, and it's trying to make a match to an existing vendor record in the system through these identification fields. And we'll talk about it in our session tomorrow. But we know that we can filter the source table. So we're filtering the vendor list by the vendor table if there's certain vendors that you don't want to process on. If there's a particular filter that you can implement to filter that source table list, or you can exclude vendors from being selected in Continia. So if there's any internal vendors or any blocked vendors that you don't want to use Continia with, you can add them to the excluded sources list. That means we're excluding this vendor from being selected or creating a template. Here's the activity that I talked about when we're suggesting those captions to add to the master template. I'll go through this in a future session. This is usually a pre-go live activity, but this page will be used to make the master template more intelligent by suggesting captions from your existing vendor templates that you've already created to maybe add them to the master template. We'll have the ability to add customized columns. So these are fields from the master template that you could add and be able to sort and filter documents on. So if you look at it, maybe invoice date or due date is a parameter that you want to sort documents on. Or maybe like a description or one of a text field or the invoice number you want to filter documents on. Or maybe you want to sort and filter documents based on an amount field. You have the ability to add it as a customizable column. And this would also be a way for you to manage documents and filter and sort documents when you're using Continia and creating those vendor templates. Here is your template list. So right now, these are the current templates in the system. And here's that master template that I mentioned, right? We'll go through this master template tomorrow, but the master template is the basis. All future vendor templates that will be created for your client will be based off of the master template. So before we start to create any individual vendor templates for your client, we want you to go through the master template and expose and configure the right fields to make sure that the client is best set up to capture the majority of information that would satisfy the majority of their client vendor invoices. So we'll go through the master template tomorrow. And then here's just some OCR processing settings. By default, when you scan an image, we're going to show that image in black and white, but you may find that you might not be able to see the document in full. So you might want to switch to color mode. Maybe there's some watermarks or maybe there's some shading that you're not able to see the document all the way. So you might want to switch to color mode. Just know that switching to color mode will increase the size of the file, which would take up more space. But you can decide, hey, maybe I only want to process a certain amount of pages per file. So by default, we're going to process the first 200 pages of those invoice files. But maybe, your client's files aren't that large. You only care about maybe the first 50 pages, or you may only care about the first 100 pages of a file. So you can kind of trickle down the number of files that we process on to maybe decrease the size of those files that get imported. But by default, it's 200 pages. And then also from here, you have the ability to turn on automatic splitting. So depending on if clients receive invoice files from their vendors where one file may contain multiple invoices in that one file, you might want to split that file automatically. So if we turn on automatic splitting, you can see that, hey, we can split on blank pages when we see them. We can split on the source ID. So because our source table is the vendor table, the source ID is the vendor ID or the vendor number. So if we find a new vendor, we'll split it, the document, and then a separator field for the purchase document category. By default, the separator field is the invoice number. So when we find a unique invoice number or a new invoice number, we could split the file as well. But just know that you can change what the separator file is for the document category or for the individual template, because each vendor will have its own unique template. So each vendor could be set up differently to maybe look for a different separator field. Invoice number is what we use by default, but maybe there's another unique field that always comes in on your client's documents that you might want to configure as a different separator field. Maybe a dimension, or maybe the purchase order number or something else could be used as what separates the document into its own unique file. So by default, we use the invoice number as the separator field for the purchase document category, but you can change it if you'd like. And I'll show you where that is tomorrow when we go through the master template. Barcodes is also a way that you could split documents if there's a barcode that separates each file between itself. So that's OCR processing settings for the purchase document category. So if you made changes to the OCR processing settings, you'll need to go back to the document categories page. And because you've changed how we process the OCR, you'll need to go to more options, actions, functions, and you'll need to export the OCR configuration files because you've made a change and you'll need to export those changes. So make sure that you're always running export OCR configuration files. Okay. So we talked about document categories, right? So the document categories that create Business Central transactions are the purchase document category for purchase invoices and credit memos, the purchase order document category, and then the sales document category to build sales orders and credit memos. And then the other document categories that you can take advantage of to attach documents to existing records is the other document categories apart from those other three. So I'll create a poll again So I just launched another poll. So the question is, if you change the OCR processing settings, what is the next step? Okay, so the question was, if you change the OCR processing settings, what is the next step? The potential answers were import a new document, open the document journal, export OCR configuration files, or restart Business Central. The answer is export OCR configuration files. You've made changes to how we process the OCR. We need to export those changes through document categories so that we can update each document category with the OCR settings. So you need to run the function export OCR configuration files. And then finally, we have another poll. The question is, which document category creates a Business Central transaction? Options are vendor, sales, customer, or all of the above. Okay, so the question was, which document category creates a Business Central transaction? The question was either vendors, sales, customer, or all the above. The answer was sales. So like we previously discussed, the document categories that create transactions are purchase, purchase order, and sales. Document categories like vendor and customer are used if there's a document that you want to submit, have scanned to attach to an existing record inside of BC. The vendor document category is for vendor cards. The customer document category is for customer cards. So, let's say like 1099s or any sort of supplemental type of document to add to vendor or customer cards, you would utilize those So there are ways to create your own document categories. If you actually wanted to create a Business Central transaction from a new document category, it would involve some development, and you might need to reach out to our technical resources at Continia to talk through your developers to figure out, what are the technical implications of creating a new document category where you want to create a different type of transaction, because obviously there's some code and, there's code units, and we need to extend our functionality to do something different in that way. But out of the box, you are able to create custom document categories to attach documents to existing records. And I'll show you and take you through that exercise. We have a couple minutes left. So it should be rather quick to take you through this exercise. What you need to do is take one of our existing document categories. Because all of these other document categories are used to attach documents to existing records, you can use one of these categories as your basis for a different type of existing record. So the path to take is taking one of the existing document categories, copying it, and then changing the underlying tables and the sources that it looks for to then find the record that you want to attach it to based on what you're looking for it to do when you configure the document category in the underlying document category settings. So I'm going to take you through the exercise of copying an existing document category and then changing the underlying settings to reflect a different record that you might want to attach a document to in Business Central. So I'm sharing my screen again. So we're here in BC, and let's say I rather create a new document category to attach a document to, let's say, a sales invoice, right? I'm creating sales orders, I'm building sales invoices, but maybe I have like receipts that I want to attach to the sales invoice that is already existing inside of Business Central. So I'm going to take one of these existing document categories that attaches to a record in BC. Let's say we're going to take the vendor document category. So I'm going to go to that page that we showed initially, set up document capture. So I'm going to run that wizard set up document capture. And the action here is we're going to export this configuration, and we're going to export this configuration to a file. This is going to create an XML file. It's going to bring up all of our settings that we have so far. I'm going to exclude everything, and I'm only going to add that particular document category that I want to bring forward and change. So I'm minimizing all of our document categories, and I'm just going to take the vendor document category, and I'm going to only include that to export. So I'm going to export the vendor document category, and I've just exported it. Okay. I'm going to save that. Okay. So I've just exported that document category. And now what you want to do is you want to take that file and you want to open it up in Notepad. So I'm in Notepad right now with that file. And this is kind of like the underlying settings for that document category. But I'm not going to touch these settings. The only thing I'm going to change is the name of the document category. Because right now you see that the document category is vendor. I'm going to run a find and replace. I'm going to take the word vendor and I'm going to replace it with what I want to rename this document category for sales invoices. So I'm going to find the word vendor and I'm going to replace it with our new name for sales invoice for the purpose of this new document category. I'm just going to replace all. So I've taken, whenever I've seen the word vendor, I'm replacing it with sales invoice. And I'm just going to save this file. And now I've saved that file, right? Now I'm going back into BC and I'm going to run set up document capture again. I'm going to run the same wizard, set up document capture, run the wizard. And now I'm going to import the configuration. I'm not going to import from online anymore. I'm going to import from the file that I've exported previously. And I'm going to drag that XML that we renamed in Notepad. So I'm attaching and importing that file that we've exported and renamed. Here's that new document category for sales invoice. So I'm going to bring that in. So we changed the name and you'll click next. So all I've done was copied an existing document category and renamed it. I exported it and then imported it into the system, right? So now you see your document categories list and you see a new document category for sales invoices. So I'll just say sales invoices. And you can see that a new email has been generated for the Continia Cloud OCR email. What I need to do now is I need to edit the document category. And you can see it still has those old setups from the vendor document category. But what's really important is we have the existing code units. We copied the category so that we can get the code units, the underlying back-end default settings of how the document category should function, because this is a document category that is attaching what we import to an existing record, but we need to change the source and the record that we want to find. So we need to go to our identification fields first, and we need to remove what we want to find first, because this was the old identification fields for vendor. Now we can change the source table. So before, with the vendor document category, the source table was vendor. But let's say that now we want to look at the sales header, because the purpose is to find sales invoices. So our source table is going to be the sales header table, because we're utilizing it to find sales invoices. We're going to use the number field as our primary field. And maybe our name filter wanted to be the bill to name. So we're looking at the sales header. Our primary key is the number in the system. And the name field is our bill to name for our customer in the sales header. And now we'll need to go to our identification fields and we need to teach the template where to look. So we are taking a document, we're bringing it in, we're scanning it, but what information are we looking for when we scan those pages to make that match to that existing record inside of BC for sales invoices? So it's up to you to determine what criteria are we going to use to make those matches to our source table, which is the sales table. Maybe the number is always going to be on those documents. So we're saying, hey, find the sales invoice number, and we'll put a high strength to the sales invoice number because the receipt will always have the sales invoice number. So we're going to use that to make our match to the existing record in BC. Or maybe we want to do the bill to name. So the bill to name of the document that we're importing will always have the customer on it. And maybe that is what we're going to use to find the record inside of BC. Maybe it's only a one strength, but you'll need something unique and something concrete that allows us to find the exact record within the source table that you want to make that match to. So that's why I selected the number for the sales header, because the number will find the exact sales invoice number that allows us to make the match for that document. So these document categories that are used to make those matches are using the source table to find the information, and is using the identification fields to make those matches. And then you always want to go to more options, actions, functions, export OCR configuration files to export and create the document file. Okay. So that's a little bit about how to create that custom document category to attach to a different type of record in BC, how you can build your own by copying something that's already existing and then changing the underlying source table and identification fields for you to find that new record that you want the document category to now find a new record inside of Business Central. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's session, where we've talked about starting a project on the right foot. We talked about those pre-kickoff requirements. We showed you where to install and activate the app from the app source extension management. We learned about what document categories are, the differences of the document categories, and we did some basic setups of document capture. And, we showed you kind of like, even if you want to create a custom document category, a little bit about how you can configure document categories to do something a little bit different.